Everyone's so quiet, that sounds like a signal. So I think we'll begin. Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for coming. For those of you who weren't here last night, this is the beginning of our conference, actually the fourth conference in a series. This one is entitled Controlling Sexuality Through Violence, Shame, and Cultural Oppression, Implications for Human Rights. There are many, many thank yous to go out, and I'm going to be brief right now because some of those were expressed last night by my colleague Tom Maloney, and I'll be offering a much more elaborate statement of gratitude tomorrow afternoon at the conclusion of the conference. But I do want to mention, of course, the great generosity of Barbara and Norman Tanner and their daughter Deb Sawyer, whose vision made it possible for this center to be created in 2006. And in fact, last month we just celebrated our 4th anniversary. So it's hard to believe. And we're just thrilled with the development of programs. There is an array of co-sponsors, as there is every year. You see those in the brochure. I'm not going to list all of them for you, but I do want to emphasize that they include colleges and departments on campus and an array of campus community organizations as well. I also want to salute the faculty working group with whom we've been working very closely now for over a year. Cliff Roski, my colleague, will say a little bit more about that group. But I want to mention especially, and I will again several other times, Alita Tu and Victoria Medina, our chief staff members at the center, without whose tireless work this event would not be possible, and that's been true several years going now. And there are many other people working behind the scenes to make something like this possible, for food, technical support, and so forth. And I urge you throughout the conference to pause and give them a thank you. At our keynote last evening, which was really the kickoff of the conference, we heard Shannon Minter speak with, well, I'll have to say, great analytical clarity and quiet passion. And I was especially impressed, Shannon, with the way you interwove personal stories and reflections with observations on social, political, and legal questions. Also, we were delighted with the questions from the audience, and that reminds me to remind you that a huge part of this conference is interaction among our guest scholars and speakers and local scholars and community representatives and the larger audience and community. And we've actually built in more time for discussion at this conference than in the past, so we hope not to be quite as rushed, at least if I don't go on too long. Just a bit about the history, philosophy, and development of the center. It was founded in 2006. Our concerns are fairly wide-ranging across issues of conflict resolution, peacemaking, human rights, and security. It's an interdisciplinary effort based in the College of Social and Behavioral Science, but with reaching out into the College of Humanities, the College of Law, and other colleges on our campus. The center is officially apolitical and nonpartisan. That said, we're not shying away from, in every year, inviting a variety of opinions, exchange of information, a forum for debate, and also dialogue toward mutual understanding. Above all, we see the center as an emerging hub of activities on this campus and beyond, and we are making connections with organizations nationally, such as the Peace and Justice Studies Association, and internationally, such as the International Peace Research Association. My name, I should have said, is George Cheney, and it's been my privilege and pleasure to work with the center as well as with the companion programs in Peace and Conflict Studies in the College of Humanities for the last 4 years. And I'm a professor in the communication department as well. In my spare time. Our programs besides this annual forum, again, we work collaboratively with the College of Humanities on the principal academic component, which is the Peace and Conflict Studies undergraduate interdisciplinary minor. I'd love to be able to talk to you more about that, but let me just mention that it's on its way to becoming a major, and you'll hear a little bit more about current and future efforts in just a moment from my colleague Kim Koronek. We are also involved in K through 12 outreach in the community, both to students and teachers. We sponsor a series of dialogues. In fact, 2 dialogues on religion and sexuality last fall were extremely well attended, and the feedback from those was universally positive. We have a budding peace library. We helped to launch what's now called the Utah Citizens Council, which is a nonpartisan group of elder statespersons, you could say, in our community who are currently tackling the topic of election reform. And we co-sponsor speakers and other kinds of events with other institutions such as Westminster College, Utah Valley University, Weber State, and so forth. Our annual forum is kind of a hybrid design in that it bridges campus and community. It's both academic and practical, dealing with issues of local, state, national, and international importance. And our topics to date have been the intangible aspects of terrorism in 2007, migration, rights, and identities in 2008, the evolution of aggression in 2009, and of course this year, as I mentioned, controlling sexuality. We don't pause very often, and so we're I'm pleased to say that we're already well at work on the conference for February 2011, which will be on water, conflict, and human rights, something of great importance to our region, our nation, and the world. And the other thing I'll mention about these conferences is that we build on networks of faculty members across the campus who are already researching and teaching in a particular area and also involved in the community service in a particular area. And we try to promote those networks so that their work will continue. And so I'm happy to say that academic volumes, edited books, special issues of journals are coming out of the first 3 conferences, and we expect that tradition to continue. But it's just wonderful to see the interdisciplinary collaboration, and for me that's been one of the greatest thrills with my work with the center. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kim Koronek, who is an assistant professor in the sociology department here at the University of Utah, and she serves as associate director of the center. She's going to say a little bit more about our activities now and looking toward the future. Thank you very much. Welcome, and if you don't feel quite refreshed, you'll find some refreshments catty corner in the back, so just beside, but don't rush out right now. So, thank you.
Thank you and welcome. I first of all wanted to reiterate some of George's comments of appreciation and gratitude to the Tanner family and the various supporters on boards that make the annual Tanner Forum and various events that the Tanner Center puts on possible. I think for those of us who've worked with the center for a while, we realize how valuable it is to have an organization and a center that really helps us to get out of our small academic boxes to reach out to the community and to broader publics to really talk about and engage in dialogue on some of the most pressing social justice and policy issues of our times. George has filled you in a bit out on some of the history of the center. I want to just take a little time to talk about where we're going in a pretty sort of brief time frame, the planned events and programs for the center for the remainder of the year. As George mentioned, for the past several years, the faculty steering committee of the Peace and Conflict Studies has been working to envision an undergraduate interdisciplinary major in Peace and Conflict Studies. So building on an undergraduate minor that has existed at the university for several years, we will put forward a proposal to several committees at the college and university level to try to make this undergraduate major a reality, forthcoming in hopefully in 2011 or 2012. And this will provide an opportunity for students to develop a theoretical, historical, and applied knowledge on the roots of conflict and approaches to peaceful conflict resolution. This spring, we also plan to expand our efforts to build a community of young scholars in peace and conflict studies. And in particular, we want to address and reach out to current graduate students at the University of Utah. So at the end of April, we haven't decided on a particular date, the Tanner Center will sponsor a social and informational gathering for graduate students whose interests focus on peace, human rights, and conflict resolution. So the intent of this gathering is to create a research interest and networking group for these students and to sort of plant the seeds for future training and programs for graduate students. So if there are graduate students or faculty mentors who may be interested in this line of research and study, be sure to let George and myself know. Some of the sort of educational and curriculum aspects of the center also involve K through 12 outreach. And we are teaming up with colleagues at the Inclusion Center and at Westminster College to co-sponsor and program a workshop for high school students this summer. And there's also been involvement in the past in summer camp programs. And this summer's workshop will focus on reaching out to underrepresented high school students and having a workshop that will address diversity, inclusion, and transition to college for underrepresented groups. Last but not least, there are several co-sponsored events that the Tanner Center will be involved in, and I wanted to just give you a sense of what's upcoming on the calendar, this event that might be of interest. March 9th and 10th, the Tanner Humanities or Tanner Human Rights Center will co-sponsor the Middle East Center's Middle East Peace Conference. On March 12th, a lecture by Lawrence Whitner, a Sunni Albany historian who will give a lecture on the future of the possibility of eradication of nuclear weapons. On March 31st, we will co-sponsor the College of Humanities Evening of Conscience, which will feature Gary Nell, the president and CEO of Sesame Workshop, who will give a program on Sesame Street Productions' work on peace and conflict resolution in war-torn countries. And then last but not least, on April 6th, the Tanner Humanities Center, we will co-sponsor their World Leaders Forum, which will feature this year's speaker, James Orbinski, the former president of Doctors Without Borders, who will speak on dignity and global health. So I guess watch your email, mark your calendars for those upcoming events. And without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Cliff Roski, who's going to talk about the Faculty Organizing Committee and the philosophy of organizing this conference this year.
Thank you. I, too, would like to thank the Tanners and all of our sponsors for bringing us all together today. I'm here, as Kim said, to welcome you on behalf of the Organizing Committee. Hopefully you've had a chance to meet some of us. From the Psychology Department, we have Lisa Diamond, David Hubner, Don Strasberg. From the Law School, Terry Kogan and myself. And from Gender Studies and English, Kathryn Stockton. For the past year, as we've been planning this conference, the leadership and the staff of the Tanner Center has worked tirelessly to keep us on track. So thank you, George and Alita and Victoria. There were certainly times when we would have been lost without you, and we've been grateful for your guidance throughout. It's a special honor for me to welcome you on behalf of the Organizing Committee because I'm easily the committee's greenest member. I, as of today, have been teaching for a grand total of 18 months, which incidentally is as long as we've been planning this conference. This date is not hard for me to remember because I first heard about the Tanner Conference on the first day of the first class of my teaching career. I had just moved here to Utah from the Castro in San Francisco, the country's most famously gay neighborhood. And rather ironically, I had moved here to teach a course on gay and transgender rights. And my San Francisco friends at the time were sort of fascinated by this development in my career. And shortly after my arrival, I was invited to come to this first planning meeting of the Tanner Conference, and I walk into the Gender Studies Lounge, and I find myself surrounded by the leading scholars in my field, psychologists, legal theorists, queer theorists. And these are not just people that are at the cutting edge of my field. These are people that defined the cutting edge of my field. And I was pretty intimidated walking in, but they made me feel very welcome that day. And I've been very grateful to be involved in this work in the past year and a half. In the months that followed, we took pains to try to develop this conference into something special, something beyond the typical format, which would reflect our own sense of surprise and delight and engagement in our discovery of each other's work. And so in particular, we've made a couple of unconventional choices in planning this conference that I'd like to call your attention to. First, to push our conversations across traditional boundaries, we've issued a broad invitation to our community, as well as to scholars throughout the university and across the country. So each panel includes one member of the local community who confronts problems of sexuality and violence directly in the provision of community services. Each panel also includes one member from our university, where we've been so pleased to discover so many people doing critical work in this field. And then finally, each panel includes one member from beyond our community and our campus, whose work has inspired us to think more broadly and more critically about our own work. To foster your opportunities to engage with each other, we've scheduled only one panel at a time here, and we've asked our speakers to keep presentations relatively brief. With this format, everyone will have a chance to attend every panel, and we will have equal time for presentations and questions from the audience after. Our hope, of course, is that this format will allow our conversations to build not only from speaker to speaker, but from panel to panel, from last night through today and into tomorrow. Above all, we hope that this conference sparks new conversations and new combinations, which will continue long after we go our separate ways. So let the conversations begin, and in light of our topic today, let them be fruitful and multiply.
Thanks, Cliff. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kathryn Stockton, professor of English and director of gender studies here at the U, and the author of two books germane to this conference, Beautiful Bottom, Beautiful Shame, Where Black Meets Queer, and The Queer Child, Growing Sideways in the 20th Century. The title of our panel this morning is Mechanisms of Violence, Harassment, Assault, and Fear. Let me start by saying that ever since Marjorie Smith in my neighborhood put me upside down in a garbage can at age 8 for some unnamed infraction of my gender, and ever since I, an obvious tomboy, deeply transgendered, crushed out on girls, leading the secret tragic life of a lovable vampire, I told myself, ever since I mercilessly teased my buddy Ed Singer for his willingness to try a plie, I've known that children are among the harassers as well as the harassed. I've known that throughout the 20th century, the century of the ghostly gay child, no one has believed in so-called gay children more than other children, whether they've turned out to be right or wrong. Is there a gay child? Is there a lively, liquid idea of a child lingering in the vicinity of the word gay, having a ghostly, terrifying, complicated, energizing, forced, or future connection to this word, or to what it means without the word itself? How is transgender related to or separate from this ghostly gayness? The question of the child makes us climb inside a cloud, a shadowy spot on a field of light, leading us in moments to cloudiness and ghostliness, surrounding children as figures in time. And speaking of shadows, I've also read my Leo Bersani, his book Homos, and his famous essay, Is the Rectum a Grave, enough to know that in his address to the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, Bersani provocatively argued that we should encourage promiscuity and non-relational forms of sexuality as ways to keep ourselves free of relationships where the real violence happens, he says. A view, by the way, largely shared but also reshaped by the edgy novels of Toni Morrison. And so we'll look at violence from the outside to the inside, from macro to micro, and thus we turn to the wisdom of our panelists to sort it all out. We're going to begin with Ron Stahl. Ron's a professor of public health at the University of Pittsburgh. His primary research focus has been in HIV prevention and behavioral epidemiology, both in the U.S. and abroad. He's also conducted numerous projects in the areas of substance abuse epidemiology, smoking, aging, mental health, and housing as healthcare. That should encompass all of you. And though he's conducted a good deal of research among gay men, he's also worked with other populations at high risk of HIV infection. Ron is a member of the National Institutes of Health Study section entitled Behavioral and Social Science Approaches to Preventing HIV/AIDS, and he serves on the Prasad Board, which is a Pittsburgh-based community organization whose mission is to meet the health needs of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities. Please welcome Ron Stahl.
And thank you so much for inviting me here. This is a great honor, and I'm looking forward to the day's deliberations. I'm going to be trying to get to a talk that I usually spend an hour on, but in 20 minutes. So let's see how well I do. The other thing to let you know is that I understand that copies of the two crucial papers on which this talk is based will be disseminated to the group, and so you guys can read, the data and that I'll be presenting in very summary form. So just focus as I run through tons of data that I've been working on for the past decade, and listen just to the logic plan. But if you want to read the papers later, they'll be made available to you. The first thing that I want to do is summarize in a single picture the scientific literature on gay men's health for the past 30 years. The scientific literature and the public health literature is just obsessed when it comes to gay men in the area between the knee and the navel. And I call this the knee and the navel problem. And it turns out, and this is a great scientific insight, I hope you guys can handle this, that gay men have other body parts. And we have heads and we have hearts. And it turns out that as a result of these other body parts, it also follows that we have other health problems. And that this has largely been ignored in much of the research on gay men's health. And I think it beggars our research, because I will make a case that many of these health problems interact. I was fortunate enough when I was at the University of California, San Francisco, to work with a group of great researchers who put together a national study on gay men's health, where we took a household-based sample of gay men who lived in San Francisco, Chicago, LA, and New York. And the reason we spent a ton of dough on getting a household-based sample is that there were enormous literatures showing, for example, that gay men drink a lot more than heterosexual men, but those samples were taken from bars. Would anybody like to walk me through the methodological problems there? And so the issue here is that if we got a household-based sample and used standardized measures of health that had been used for the general population of Americans, we wanted to be able to show whether gay men suffered from a whole series of health disparities that had already shown up in the literature, like violence, victimization, substance use, smoking, and so on. That was the idea here. And our thought was that when we got these very carefully, rigorously drawn large-scale samples, and we ended up with close to 3,000 men in this sample, that a lot of these differences would go away. Instead, when we did the analyses of these data sets, and these are all the references and some pretty in the mainstream literature, what we ended up with was a very sobering literature. There are very, very high rates of depression among gay men. The rate that we got from the Urban Men's Health Study was close to 20%. The highest rate we got for men in the general population was about 8% using this exact same scale, and that was a study that looked at men over the age of 60, and we're measuring lifetime depression, not depression at any one point in a cross-sectional sample. Very high rates of attempted suicide, very high rates of childhood sexual abuse. A study that these findings have now been replicated in about 40 studies with the childhood sexual abuse thing. as everyone knows, very, very high rates of HIV infection, probably 50 times greater in most studies than men in the general population. Very high rates of substance use and abuse, very high rates of partner violence, and this is just to skim some of the very sobering and grim findings that we got from the Urban Men's Health Study. I helped out on a lot of these analyses, and as I started working with my colleagues on these, I started noticing that these things were related to each other. And I started getting curious, what was this interrelation of these epidemics about? And so I did a little analysis where I modeled substance use, depression, partner violence, and childhood sexual abuse. Let's see if I can get this. Oh, good. I can get this contraption to work. Controlling for the usual suspects in these kinds of analysis, controlling for these variables, looking at the men who are more likely to have substance use. And what I did was, controlling for all this, looking at substance use, I was able to show that the men who had current partner violence were 2.2 times more likely to have, the substance abusers were 2.2 times more likely to have current partner violence, 1.4 times more likely to have depression. The depressed men were 1.9 times more likely to be survivors of childhood sexual abuse, 1.6 times more likely to have partner violence, 1.4 times more likely to be substance abusers. I'll let you work through the rest of the numbers. What this table simply says is that controlling for a whole set of background, important demographic variables with the AIDS epidemic, there are at least 4 psychosocial epidemics among gay men that are interacting and making each other worse. So what has this got to do with HIV infection? We then just did this very, very simple thing, controlling for the same background variables. Counted up the number of psychosocial epidemics for which the men scored positively on our scales. So there were 4 epidemics we were looking at, so 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And as you can see, the greater the number of the psychosocial health epidemics, the more likely it was for these men to have had recent high-risk sexual behavior, very conservatively scored, and more likely to be HIV positive. The one exception is the cell in this corner. We got out of the field just as the protease era was starting, and already about 100,000 gay men had died of HIV infection. How you stay alive with these 4 psychosocial epidemics on board and HIV infection over the long haul is beyond me. And I think these smaller numbers reflect a higher mortality in this group. Okay, so to recap, what we've got here are 4 psychosocial epidemics that are driving high-risk sexual behavior that are in turn driving an infectious disease epidemic. Isn't that interesting? So I was showing this analysis to a friend of mine at the Centers for Disease Control, and he goes, "Oh, you found a syndemic." And I said, "What's a syndemic?" And it turns out that an anthropologist by the name of Meryl Singer had been working with a group of injection drug users in Connecticut, and it theorized the existence of these interlocking psychosocial health epidemics that were driving HIV infection. This term is now in the medical literature, and there's a website at the bottom here. The website there is of the syndemic website that can walk you through the literature on interlocking epidemics. So this is a condition. Syndemics occur in marginalized populations, and they're not unique to gay men by any stretch of the imagination. And these interlocking psychosocial health epidemics. We've known for about a century and a half that marginalized populations have poor health. What we've never been able to show is the causal pathway between culture and a sick person. And I just don't see how you can make this causal pathway work without invoking the syndemics concept in some way. I think it's going to be an increasingly important idea. Well, we got done with this analysis, and we showed that the syndemics exist, and we published the paper, and I thought, well, why would gay men have a syndemic? Most of the other populations that have been looked at were rather marginalized, impoverished inner-city populations. The Urban Men's Health Study was about 80% white. About 80% of these guys were college graduates. They were solidly middle class, and they lived in some of America's richest zip codes. Why would a group of predominantly white men with a college education have a syndemic? And so I started thinking about what would a syndemic theory look like. And when I was thinking about that, I started reading the literature on health disparities on gay men. And one of the things that really struck me about the literature was that it talked a lot about that homophobia causes poor health as a direct effect of poor health on men's health. But it hit me that if homophobia was a culture-wide phenomenon, it affects everybody, right? including kids. And so I started looking into what is the literature on violence victimization on queer youth, and what would the long-term repercussions of violence victimization among queer youth have in terms of the production of poor health in adults. And I'd say, unfortunately, the press is picking up on this stuff more and more and more. This is a story that showed up on the front page of the New York Times a couple years ago. And what the story starts with is this guy, Billy, in Fayetteville, Arkansas, was waiting for a school bus with his sister, and a group of boys drove up in a car and took pictures of each other, brutalizing this guy and blooding him into the ground because he was the class fag, while his sister sat there screaming. And what these guys are doing is they're enacting what I call masculinity panic. And to be able to prove your masculinity, to win at the masculinity game, there has to be a loser, right? And every class has a loser. And they make an example of this guy, and these guys are exposed to unbelievable amounts of violence that's associated with masculinity panic. We all know what we're talking about here. This thing goes on for a long, long thing, but on another event, this guy was brutalized in a way that would if we did this to anybody else as adults, we'd be arrested. This kid was attacked on a school bus. Guess who was blamed for the violence on the school bus? Billy. His mother, fortunately, and the reason this is even in the New York Times is his mother protected him. Usually the parents beat up the kids to butch them up, right? His mother complained to the school board about it, and they reluctantly looked on the tape of the school bus. And before the principal showed his mother the film of her son being publicly attacked and humiliated on the school bus, he handed her a box of Kleenex. So that, and the kid was not finally thrown out of school because he was the victim, not the perpetrator. Billies exist in every single class. We all know them. Now, the direct effect of this public humiliation is that the billies get brutalized a lot, but the kids, the proto-queer kids, the kids who are working on their sexuality, trying to understand their sexuality, as we just heard about, are watching these public enactments of masculinity panic, and they learn to self-regulate with a vengeance. They learn to walk a tightrope, they learn to pass, they learn to not stick out, and they learn to not attempt pliés. And what happens with all of this is the beginning of internalized homophobia. This is where internalized homophobia comes from. What we're talking about here is cultural violence against a group of young people who have no community to protect them. They have no resources to understand what's happening to them, and they have no means of protecting themselves at an age when their sexuality is blooming, when they're establishing their beginning of their adult identity, and that the wounds of this kind of violence at such a tender age have got to cut very, very deep. What I did was, and this is the idea here is this kind of, in the book chapter that you can send out, is basically that the beginning of all this is the idea of prototypical or proto-internalized homophobia and running through to the production of synemic conditions. I won't walk through that. This was the analysis in the American Journal of Public Health article that I just talked about. Now, there are any number of corollaries of syndemic theory. One of these is that syndemic processes should already be in place among young boys at a very early age. The next is that if we address among adults multiple epidemics at once, the effect sizes on all our health programs should be increased. So you want to make AIDS prevention work? Help men who are depressed, who are current violent victimization, substance using. Their feet are in concrete. If we help them address those other epidemics, they'll respond to HIV prevention much better. And at last, resilience may be an untapped resource. In terms of what I'm doing with the theory in my group at the University of Pittsburgh is we're actually using, Mike Marshall's been leading this out of our group, a series of meta-analyses to test the idea of syndemic processes at a very early age. So in terms of substance use, this is a paper that Dr. Marshall published. These are odds ratios looking at the probability of LGBT youth using all this long list of drugs compared to their heterosexual counterparts. Already, before the onset of adulthood, gay kids are using a lot more drugs. This is a follow-up paper that Mike's doing using the Ad Health data set where they actually happen to ask, finally, sexuality questions. What we can show is that the LGBT youth, LGB youth here, their increase in substance use is happening much faster as they come of age than their heterosexual counterparts. Again, another clue in that. In terms of depression, I'm running through this very, very quickly. In terms of suicidality and depression, gay kids are far more likely to be depressed than their heterosexual counterparts. Suicidality, an odds ratio of 3, depression 2. In terms of violence victimization, this is a paper that Mark Friedman is doing out of our group. It's under review right now. We're hoping it'll get accepted. But basically, gay kids get beat up a lot more than heterosexual kids. In terms of, as we all know, in terms of the relationship between violence victimization in youth and poor health outcomes in adulthood, these are basically conditions from the Urban Men's Health Study of boys who had forced sex as youth. This is the list of health outcomes as adulthood that they were more likely than other gay men to have. So the gay men who had childhood sexual abuse were more likely to have current partner abuse, depression, high-risk sex, HIV infection, current recent suicidality, and gay-related victimization. These are the same kinds of relationships for significant harassment in youth and physical abuse. We're testing this theory now with retrospective data from the MACs. I can't give you the final analyses, but I will say that in an adult group of gay men where we very carefully measured every single one of these concepts, the initial results are looking very promising in terms of a positive test of the theory of explaining health disparities among American gay men. In terms of resilience, I just want to point out, as one of the other corollaries of this, is that there's a lot of evidence for resilience in these analyses, too. Where's the resilience in this slide? I'm running very short of time, probably over it. But notice that the men who had 3 or 4 of these conditions, 3/4 of them did not have recent high-risk sex. And 3/4 of them, at least the survivors, were not HIV positive. Even though these guys had significant co-occurring psychosocial epidemics, these men were not faring badly when it came to the AIDS epidemic. So there's some incredible strength going on that we don't know about. I've been doing analyses of the multi-center AIDS cohort study looking at stimulant drug use over time. And you'll notice the blue line going up are men who are having uptake of basically methamphetamine and crack cocaine use. And there's a group of guys, the purple line at the top, who've been heavy users for a long period of time. That accounts for about 15% of the cohort. All right? There's another 15% of the cohort who's getting better on their own because there's no treatment for this kind of drug use, and another group of guys who basically use low levels of these drugs for long periods of time. What we do in all of our studies is to focus on that 15% who are kind of messing up their lives and ignoring a like proportion of the cohort who are resolving their substance use careers on their own. Now, in terms of intervention design, it seems to me understanding what's going on with the guys who get healthier over time will teach us at least as much as understanding what's going wrong with the guys who are having a hard time. So some concluding thoughts. I hope I've convinced you that there are multiple co-occurring epidemics occurring among gay men that are driving the HIV epidemic. Progress on fighting any one of these epidemics will probably help out with all of the others. We need to raise all the health boats in our community. We need to think about improving public health practice in doing this, which is a difficult thing, but it can be done. Our friends on the religious right say the reason that there are health disparities among gay men are that there's something wrong with gay men. If you're going to make that case, you need to be able to explain away the evidence that we're collecting to show that it's violence victimization at an early age that's driving these health disparities, not homosexuality itself. Get rid of the violence victimization. You'll raise levels of health among gay men. We need to figure out a better job about how to protect our youth and to take care of the next generation to make sure that they're not brutalized in ways that a lot of us were brutalized as kids, and public health practice. Now, in terms of the resilience thing, I just want to end as an add-on to the wonderful talk last night on marriage. And thinking about the deficit analysis, in terms of depression, this is analysis from Tom Mills' analysis of depression with the Urban Men's Health Study, where he showed to predict men who are depressed that not having a partner, not identifying as queer, greater violence victimization in the past 5 years, and alienation for the gay community were important predictors of depression among gay men. Any of us had those things happen, we'd be depressed too, right? But and the usual response to this is to do interventions at the level of the individual. But what would happen if we did an interesting little structural intervention to change the culture that it made it possible for gay men and lesbians to get married? Would, in marriage, we acknowledge the depth of our commitment to each other? This beautiful photograph of Lyons and Martin getting married. Strengthen the connections and protection of our families, our connections to our spiritual lives, our connections within the community, and to our society at large. So that we can try to do the individual level interventions, we can also try to do the structural interventions to try and address endemic production in gay population. Notice also, in terms of the resilience argument, that we were able as a community to do the fight for marriage while we were also fighting a deadly epidemic. And that this suggests that there's huge amounts of resilience in our community. I think that in times of our scientific agenda, it's time to address the question of not only weaknesses in terms of what's driving these epidemics, but also strengths. Address the weakness, harness our strengths so that we can raise levels of health in our community. Thank you so much, and I apologize for going over.
Thanks very much, Ron. Leone Jones is a licensed clinical social worker who has been providing mental health services to LGBT clients in community settings and in her private practice for more years than she'd like to admit, she says, though under pressure she has admitted to about 15 years. She is the owner of SLC Body Mind Fitness, where she provides psychotherapy as well as physical fitness services to adults and adolescents. A good bit of her practice involves working with individuals who do not conform to gender norms, and I have a strong feeling that she herself is not to be messed with on a spinning bike. Leanne Jones.
Hi, I'm glad to be here also, and it is an honor to be able to speak to you today. As Kathryn said, I've been working in the community for, 17 years. I'm one of those people that likes to think that I'm really 10 years younger than I am. That's what vanity does. Anyway, a good portion of my practice is, as Kathryn said, dedicated to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and gender variant clients. So I get to talk about this issue from a different perspective, which is kind of how I see things on the ground, the things that I see day to day, the people that I see, the people that I talk to and listen to. So when I was talking to Kathryn about my presentation and asking her what she thought I should address and talk about, her advice was that I should talk about whatever it is I feel passionate about. So I thought that was really cool, because I don't get to do that all the time. But one thing I did learn several years ago about myself and my practice is that I am very passionate and enthusiastic about helping people become more of who they are. Let me say that one more time. I'm passionate about helping people become more of who they are. How this relates to the work I do in the LGBT community and to this conference is that when people face violence, shame, and oppression, for safety's sake, are forced to do things such as hide, run, restrict, pretend, shut down, cover up, and in other words, become less of who they are. And that's what I want to talk about today. So just as it's important to know the different forms of harassment, and Ron talked about bullying and physical assault and some of the things that happen. It's also important for us to think about the different levels that violence takes place. And I think Kathryn said this, from meta levels to micro levels. So I'm going to run through just really quickly what that means or what some of those levels are. First of all, problems related to this issue happen on social or institutional levels. And some examples of that would be restricted social norms and assumptions, and ideas about what thoughts, feelings, and behaviors we are allowed to have or we're supposed to have, what's acceptable. And another area that I think is a problem on kind of a social level is that we have a readily accepted lack of access to health care to vulnerable populations. The second level is on a state or local level. Violence, harassment, and oppression happen every day at schools, churches, and places of employment, as well as lack of protection by police, and sometimes even harassment by the very people who are supposed to protect us. Thirdly, interpersonally, individuals risk losing friends, families, and other important relationships when they resist social control. And finally, it's common for the same individuals to internalize the hurtful messages. And this often plays out in problems with substance abuse, unsafe sex practices, or in extreme and yet not uncommon cases, suicide attempts or genital mutilation. So instead of lecturing further, what I want to do is use my time to give voice to individuals in the community and to give voice to the individuals in the community who are often the victims or survivors of the various forms of violence that we're talking about. So as a psychotherapist, one of the first things that I do when someone walks through my door, one thing I've learned really well is to try to make people comfortable, because if they're not comfortable, they won't talk to me. Anyway, these stories are really uncomfortable. So it goes a little bit against my grain. But what I realize is that we can't talk about violence without talking about violence. So it just is what it is. So I've put these stories into first-person perspective, but please know that they've been significantly altered to protect client confidentiality and identities. And I've also chosen examples from clients that don't conform to traditional gender norms. And I chose those because we often exclude transgender folks and because I am so incredibly lucky to get to work with that population on a day-to-day basis. I love my transgender clients. So as I read these couple stories, I want you to think about what forms of oppression, violence, assault, what you hear happening, and also what the different levels that I identified are that take place. Okay, so my first one actually is a letter, and again I changed it a little bit, but it's really touching. If I can find it. It's here somewhere. Okay, this is an approximation of a letter I just received a couple months ago. Dear Ms. Jones, I'm 75 years old. I live in the South, but found your name on the internet. I've been married for 54 years and have 4 children and a bunch of grandkids. I'm writing to you because since I was a teenager, I've known that I'm a man inside. I've never told the secret to anyone except now you. I've always been afraid to tell that if I did, my children would be taken away and that I'd be locked up somewhere for the rest of my life. Here is my address. Please write back to me, and please, please help me. That's the letter. I did write back. I'm waiting for a response. Hopefully I'll get one. The next story I want to read to you is from a middle-aged client, and again, I sort of made parts of it up, but I'm going to read it anyway. I'm a 44-year-old biological male. I've always known I was a girl. When I was around 5 years old, I started playing house with my sister, and I wanted to be the mom. She let me put some of her clothes on. When I did, I remember feeling very happy. The happiness didn't last. When she told my dad, later he tormented me, called me names, and beat me that night for about 3 hours. After that, I started getting into trouble, stealing, lying, and fighting. When I started cutting my wrists at age 14, I was put into a psychiatric institution. At first, they tried shocking my genitals. It didn't work. When that didn't work, the staff made me walk through the halls naked. My peers stood in their doorways and laughed and made fun of me because only boys have penises. Most of that story really is true. And it's kind of shocking even to think that those things happened not that long ago. So this person was around 44 or 45. So what would that be? 30 years ago, maybe less? Not really that long ago. The one thing that I think about when I read these stories, when I think about my clients, is the function of fear. That I think it's the most incredibly effective way to control sexuality and gender expression. So on a more hopeful note, though, I want to point out that there are some things that are being done by local organizations to reduce violence, shame, and fear. And I really want to give a shout out to the Utah Pride Center. They are doing amazing things. They have a broad variety of services, and recently have really, I have to say, exploded their services and support for transgender or trans-identified people. I actually had a client recently that was really resistant to going to they have an adult transgender group, they have youth groups also, but she was really resistant to going to the group and really fearful and anxious, of course. She went anyway and came back the next week and said, I walked in and I felt like I was finally home. And I think that's a pretty touching story. Also, the LGBT Resource Center here on campus is a great champion of education and support for the LGBT community. Probably know that. And although not all people are as lucky, I'm inspired every day by parents and families who may take a while, but ultimately are willing to stretch and grow to support and accept their loved ones. And I'm also happy to see that more and more youth are identifying and addressing their trans identities. Over the past even 5 years, I've seen less clients in their 40s and 50s and more in their teens and early 20s. So that is amazing stuff. I love that. Some of the things moving ahead that I just want to mention, and again, Ron sort of pointed to some of these, but what I think needs to happen really is education, and especially in regard to transgender folks. Nobody knows anything about this, like nobody. It's crazy. I've had clients that come to me and they say, I went to see a doctor, my family doctor, and I decided to tell them that I have some problems with my gender, and they told me that I would need to move to Boston or California, that there's no way I could transition or have any hormone therapy here in Salt Lake. And the crazy thing really is that we have a huge transgender population here, huge. You wouldn't even, I can't even, I was thinking about, as I was preparing to talk to you today, I was thinking about how many transgender clients I've seen over the last several years. And I want to say it's really, really close to 200. I mean, that's really, without going through my charts and doing all that, I see probably, on average, 7 or 8 transgender folks a week. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. So just education and information, not only, like I said, people in society at large are uneducated, but therapists and physicians that give really bad advice and information and inaccurate information. Legislative support is really important. Something that appeared in my email box this week from Equality Utah and HRC of Utah asked if we would call our respective Salt Lake School board members because they're working to add gender identity and sexual orientation to their non-discrimination policy. So there are plenty of areas that we can become involved in politically. And I always like those little things I can do, like write a 2-sentence, statement to someone on the school board. That's pretty easy. Even I can do that. Financial support. I don't know of any insurance companies that cover transgender care. It's incredibly expensive, and most individuals just simply don't have the resources. One of the problems with that is that when people don't have resources, they don't pass. They don't pass as easily, and they become even more a target and likely to be victimized by people in society. So while we wait for health care reform, I think it'd be really cool if we could start to partner with nonprofit agencies. Actually, I'm working with Planned Parenthood of Utah to try to get them some of their states in the National Planned Parenthood Association. Some states do provide a hormone replacement therapy and services for transgender care. In Utah, as of yet, that's not true. So, and that doesn't mean they're not LGBT friendly, because they truly are, and they're truly supportive of our community. But I'm going to push them a little bit to see if we can get them to provide more services for transgender folks. And also, I think scholarships to cover at least non-surgical costs, costs related to legal name changes and gender changes, as well as hormone replacement therapy. And I think those, and I think especially I was thinking at the university level, and I was thinking about the LGBT Resource Center. I'm going to have to talk to Kathy. But it'd be really cool if there was a fund of money, again, even if it was a small fund of money. It costs about $350 for someone to go to court and have a judge make a legal name and or gender change. And for college students, and since we're talking about how youth are coming out more and more, $350 is a lot, as is therapy. I do really my absolute best with the sliding fee scale, but it puts people in a bind. They have to come to therapy, and they have no money to come to therapy. And there's a good argument to be had. Am I doing okay? Oh, okay, my time's up. There's a good argument to be had, which is that people shouldn't have to come to therapy. That people should be able to be on hormones or to make changes to their physical bodies without somebody's stamp of approval, and I completely get that. Okay, I'm going to read one more thing really quick, and it's because it's kind of funny. I really like this particular Visa ad campaign for some reason, so you'll get what I'm saying in just a minute. So it's certainly not the norm that people can afford to do the things that they want to do in their gender transitions, but one person that I'm working with happens to have the kind of resources and support that she needed to have to transition fully. So hair transplants, $18,000. Breast augmentation, $8,000. Bottom surgery, also known as sex reassignment or gender reassignment surgery, $22,000. Facial hair removal, $8,000. Tracheal shave, $3,000. The chance to be yourself, priceless. I had to add that all up, and what did I come up with? Oh, I didn't write it down. It's a lot of money. Oh, it's $59,000. That's a lot. That's almost half a house for a lot of people. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I'm really looking forward to getting to talk more during our discussion portion. So thank you.
Lisa Diamond is Associate Professor of Psychology and Gender Studies at the University of Utah, where she is an internationally recognized expert on female sexuality. So if you've got sex questions, there's your expert right over there. Professor Diamond is best known for her unprecedented 15-year longitudinal study of 100 lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, and unlabeled women, whom she has been interviewing every 2 years since 1995, tracking changes in their sexual identities, attractions, and behaviors over time. Not sure how that math works out, because I thought you were 25, but okay, since 95. Her 2008 book, Sexual Fluidity, has been awarded the Independent Publishers Book Award and the Distinguished Book Award from the American Psychological Association Society for the Study of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgendered Issues. She's received numerous other recognitions for her outstanding work and has been awarded grants in support of her research from entities such as the National Institute for Mental Health, the American Psychological Foundation, the American Institute for Bisexuality, and the Templeton Foundation. Please welcome Lisa Diamond.
How do we unlock it? And then, is there a password? Click OK. Oh, I see. It says password 10 or 10. Shh, tell everybody. Well, now we're locked out. It's seems to be in a holding pattern.
You wait. I don't know either. Where's IMX?
Well, we tried that, but it won't respond to anything else right now. Ah, wait. Okay. Yay! Okay. All right. Sorry for that refreshing pause. Hope we gave you a chance to digest. I'm sort of glad that I'm going last because Kathryn started by talking about children. And I'd like actually to take us back, to sort of circle back to talking about children and about development, which I think is more interesting to do now that we've talked a little bit about adults and about the manifestations of oppression and regulation that clearly are visible in the lives of sexual minority and transgender adults. And we're going to be talking more and more about those populations throughout the conference. So I do think it's sort of instructive to go back to childhood briefly, partly to think about the ways in which these mechanisms of regulation first start to become evident. And really to think about the developmental context of regulation of sexuality, especially in the home. We're going to be talking a lot about social forms of oppression. We've talked about structural things, about the influence of laws about same-sex marriage. But I do think and we've talked about, Kathryn being turned upside down in trash cans. So, we know that there's a peer context, but there's also, I think, a really relevant family context that we have to wrestle with as well. I also want to spend some time talking about gender. In some ways because before the child's sexuality becomes evident to their parents or their peers, you could argue that the reason that gender gets so much attention in terms of kids who don't conform to gender norms is because it's treated by parents and peers sort of as a proxy for sexuality, as if before there is some evident sexual desire or behavior that society or parents or peers want to regulate, gender is pretty evident and provides a sort of sideways route toward regulation that I think you could argue is fundamentally interconnected with sexuality over the life course in a way that makes it really impossible to talk about the regulation of sexuality without talking about the regulation of gender, and back and forth and back and forth. I want to, as a case study, talk a little bit about the diagnostic category of gender identity disorder in childhood and some of the sort of implications of thinking about that as a classification for types of children and sort of what that means. One of the things that I think it makes it a useful site to think about some of these issues is that there's long been plenty of vigorous critique within the psychological community about the degree to which the panic over treating gender deviant children is really a homosexual panic, and to the degree that children end up getting referred to gender identity centers. Some have said, you know what, you might as well not even call it gender identity disorder of childhood. You could call it the "oh no, my child is a homosexual" syndrome, and more specifically, "oh no, my son is a homosexual syndrome," because boys are 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with GIDC than girls. The criteria are also looser for boys than girls, which makes it easier to be diagnosed as having a gender identity disorder. And that's something I want to talk about as well, that a lot of these sort of regulatory forces that we're talking about operate very differently on boys than on girls. And that's something that I want to make sure that we don't lose track of as we move through this conference and talk about some of these mechanisms of regulation. Then I'm also going to talk a little bit about some data that I've collected with my colleague Dave Huebner here in Salt Lake on sort of gender conforming and non-conforming behaviors among little boys and little girls here in across the Wasatch Front. And some of the questions I think that raises about the degree to which the behavior that freaks people out is pursuing behaviors that are like the other sex or not pursuing behaviors that are like your own sex. We tend to lump those together, right? We think that the sissy boys are boys who are doing girly things and not boy things, and that the tomboys are doing boyish things and not girlish things. But part of what's interesting about the data that I'm going to show you is that those are separable sort of constructs. Are you doing the things that your gender should do, and are you not doing the things that the other gender should do? And can you sort of mix and match those two sort of combinations? And I'm going to argue that you can and that you should, and that we need to do that in order to understand exactly where the sites of regulation are, socially and in the family. So let me talk first about the extremes, the most deviant children, the children that would be diagnosed with gender identity disorders of childhood. And this is a category in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is sort of the Bible for psychiatric diagnoses. This category was added to the DSM in 1980, which many have argued, just simply cannot be all that coincidental, given that homosexuality was removed as a pathology, of course, in 1973. So some have argued, well, great, that's convenient. We've taken the pathology out of homosexuality. We've now just located it in gender deviance, so that there's still some pathologizing going on. We're just sort of identifying it differently. The definition of GIDC is a strong and persistent cross-gender identification, persistent discomfort with one's assigned sex or sense of inappropriateness in the gender role of that sex. And that's not enough. More importantly, and this is what makes it a disorder according to the DSM, there has to be psychological distress involved. It's not just that like all sissies and tomboys are bad. It's the unhappy sissies and tomboys that are bad. There must be evidence of clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of human functioning. Now, what's really notable is that the DSM is agnostic as to the source of the distress. It does not state that the pathology or the distress arises inherently from being gender nonconforming. So, we know that social forces produce a lot of this distress, but the DSM doesn't make a distinction as to whether there's a difference between kids who are distressed because they're distressed or kids who are distressed because their parents or their peers are sort of punishing them. Just to give an example of some of the behaviors that can get you categorized as GIDC. So some of the potential criteria are preference for playmates of the opposite sex, for girls wanting to pee standing up, claiming that you will grow a penis, assertion that you will not ever grow breasts or menstruate, for boys wanting to wear a dress, and that's interesting. For boys, the criteria would be wanting to wear a dress. For girls, it's more restrictive. Girls have to actually refuse to wear dresses. So just wanting to wear pants isn't enough. You have to only want to wear pants, whereas for boys, just saying that you want to wear a dress is enough. So you're seeing there the gender difference in the use of the criteria. Now, by talking about this, it's almost too easy to trash any diagnoses in the DSM. The DSM is just a convenient whipping boy for anyone that wants to talk about social regulation of anything. I know, and the point I want to make, again, is the different standards for girls versus boys and the inability or the sort of reluctance to talk very specifically about what the source of the distress is. And that was partly what motivated Dave Huebner and I to collect data in Salt Lake City and specifically to ask questions about the normative range of variation in gender typical and atypical behavior, and how parents respond to variation across that spectrum. Because our feeling is, to this extent that there is distress involved, the distress has a source, and early on it's most likely to have its source in the family. And that even if you are an absolutely gender conforming child, if you are gender conforming because you know how your parents would respond if you stepped outside that boundary, that's psychopathology, right? Or at least that's a recipe for it, that the behavior itself is not what we should be focusing on, but the source of social stigmatization that might be there even for kids who fall within that normal range. So so what I want to sort of talk about is whether the issue is the presence of typical behavior, the presence of atypical behavior, or the absence of typical behavior, and the role of parents and peers and institutions. And I want to keep highlighting that boys are really the ones in the lurch. We sort of have set up a system in our society where to be male is to be not gay. That in order for boys growing up to demonstrate that they're appropriately masculine, part of the reason they want to beat up other gay boys is because that's a great way of proving that you're not a gay boy yourself, right? So I really want to be highlighting some of the gender differences there. So I'm going to show you a little bit about 826 children that we've collected data on here in the Wasatch Front between 5 and 17 years of age. Their parents were the reporters. We had a team of RAs, some of whom are here, who approached parents in the waiting rooms of pediatricians' offices saying, would you like to fill out this survey about children's play preferences? We didn't say, we're looking for your sissy boys, right? Children's activity preferences, and the sorts of things that they reported on are pretty standard in the literature on gender typical and atypical behavior. Playing with trucks, playing with dolls, swords, tools, tea sets, trains, jewelry, Then we added some neutral things like watching TV and playing video games. Whether the child likes to dress like a boy or a girl or a woman or a man, fantasy play as a boy or a girl or a woman or a man, things like that. And importantly, rather than sort of putting all these behaviors on one scale, where the more gender typical you are, the less gender atypical you are, we sort of separately are pulling out girl-typed behavior and boy-typed behavior so that you can allow kids to be high on both, low on both, high on one, low on the other. Okay, so I'm going to just show you the sort of distribution of gendered behavior in these boys. And so, you know, we have the number of children on the y-axis, and just you're going to be seeing how many kids rarely engage in these behaviors, sometimes engage in these behaviors, always engage in these behaviors. So atypical behaviors on the left, typical behaviors on the right, and these are boys. Right, so here are the boys' boy-type games, playing with trucks, playing with, you know, swords. You can see most of them are in that always zone. There's that one little kid over in rarely. We're gonna get a good look at him. And then the atypical behavior in pink. Of course, I had to be extremely gender stereotypical in making the graph. You see most of the boys are rarely pursuing the atypical behaviors. There's that one that's always, right? And then the key, I think, is what I call this sort of danger zone of areas where you've got boys who are not doing what they ought to be doing or are doing what they ought not to be doing. And you see there's a fairly small number of boys in there. And as we're going to see, there's going to be a lot more girls in there. So let's show you the girls. Same basic thing, atypical on the left, typical on the right. So here's the girls' gender typical behavior, and the distribution looks a lot like the boys. For the atypical behavior, it's shifted over. Boy-type behavior is just much more acceptable for girls to do than girl-type behavior is for boys. So you have a lot more girls who are sometimes engaging in atypical behavior. And that sort of danger zone is much bigger. And that, you know, the sort of width of that bar is the same. We're looking for kids who are in that sometimes range. But there's a lot more girls who are not doing girly things or who are doing boy-type things, which raises the question of whether those behaviors are related. Are the girls who are doing boy-type things also not doing girl-type things? So that's what I'm going to show you next. So the question basically is gender-typical behavior yoked to gender atypical behavior. So basically every little kid is graphed on this graph in terms of their specific combination of boy-type and girl-type behavior. So gender typical is on that axis, gender atypical is on the x-axis. So in order to make sense of this, keep in mind that if you are an extremely gender-conforming child, you would be up in the upper left-hand corner, right? Because you would be high on gender typical behavior, and you would be low on gender atypical behavior, right? So these are good little boys and girls doing exactly what everybody wants them to do. And then the deviant children, right, the chronic sissies and tomboys, are in the lower right-hand corner because they would always be doing atypical behavior and rarely be doing gender-typical behavior. All right, so what do we actually find? Here are the boys, right? So if you look at those two boxes, most of the boys are conforming. They're in that perfectly appropriate box, and there aren't too many extreme sissies. What I find interesting are these two other categories, right? And the upper right-hand corner is basically boys who are doing lots of gender atypical behavior and lots of gender typical behavior. So I like to call them the manly sissies, right? They're wearing dresses and, you know, wielding swords and fighting. Then in the lower left-hand corner, you have boys who are neither doing a lot of gender typical or atypical behavior. I like to think of them as computer nerds. I mean, what else are they doing? It's probably like a lot of World of Warcraft. Now let's look at the girls. The girls are much more spread out. There's still the majority of girls are up in that perfectly appropriate zone up in the upper left. And again, you don't have too many extreme tomboys. But look at how big these two groups are. So I like to call these the butchy femmes because, again, they're doing lots of boy-type things. They're doing lots of girl-type things. We have more computer nerds in the lower left-hand category. But again, I think what's relevant is the size of those groups. And it raises, I think, a lot of questions about what the parents' responses to these more ambiguous cues about gender really are, right? What is it that disturbs you? I think it's really relevant that in the DSM criteria for GIDC, they talk about wanting to wear a dress for boys or refusing to wear a dress for girls. They completely collude those two categories of doing the right, you know, whether you are or not doing the right thing and whether you are or not doing the wrong thing. But I think we don't know a lot about the implications in the home for not showing the behavior you ought to be showing and for showing the behavior you ought not to be showing. We do know that moms and dads respond very differently to these sorts of issues. As you might imagine, fathers tend to be more concerned about gender-related behavior in their children, especially their boys. Mothers tend to be more tolerant, although there's a lot of variation, and that's one of the things that Dave and I are going to be looking at is, are there characteristics of the parents that help us predict which parents have a lot of trouble with this and which parents don't? Does it have to do with their gender roles? Does it have to do with their history? We also, of course, boys tend to be more stigmatized than girls when it comes to these things. We want to look at how those sort of things interact in the home. Age matters too. And the literature sort of suggests there are two things that freak parents out. First is when these gender deviant behaviors show up really, really early. Like the fact that it's early tends to freak parents out. But the fact that it persists into puberty is another thing that freaks parents out. So too early is scary, too late is scary. And how those things interact over time is also something that I don't think we have sort of sufficiently unpacked. Then there's the social context, right? We're in Utah. We're going to have a very different environment of approval or disapproval for both acting like your gender or acting like the other than, you know, New York City or California or any place that you can name. And finally, the $6 million question, when exactly does sexuality come in? We know that it's a subtext that sort of lies underneath a lot of the panic around gender-related behavior, but we don't know a lot about the degree to which these are sort of consciously realized and expressed by parents or, importantly, by kids themselves, and the degree to which kids who are struggling in a way that they may not even have words to sort of give voice to, the connection between their own gender-related behavior and their sexuality. What does it mean that I don't feel like wearing a dress? You know, everybody else seems to think it means something. You know, what do I think it means? I think that's important for helping us to try and understand what the relative risk profiles of different kids might be. One of the reasons that Dave and I are doing this study is that we're hoping to convince the organizers of the National Children's Study, which is a longitudinal study of 100,000 children around the United States. And Salt Lake is one of the vanguard sites. The data that we collected was funded by a pilot project by the National Children's Study. We're hoping to see if we can get them to include some measures of gender. It would be the most comprehensive longitudinal study of gender atypical children that had ever been done. And it would have enough information on their parents as well that it might actually allow us to pull apart what are the factors that actually put these kids on different risk profiles and what's the long-term sort of prognosis for different combinations of kids with different types of parents. So with those sorts of issues on the table, I'll leave it there.
So now we invite your questions, and I believe, are your mics turned on? Has somebody turned on mics? So, okay, great, you're plugged in. So please ask questions of our panelists, because if you don't, I will, and they would like to be saved by you. Yes, Ferry's good to go.
So I think this is for all the panelists, but especially for Lisa and Leann. As a non-psychologist, I may sound incredibly nice, but with that introduction. So assuming that psychopathologies are not completely socially constructed, the R.G. Lang kind of vision, that there are some pathologies that matter and that need help. My question is there actually a pathology of GIDC, or is it only a pathology because it's oppressed by families and by society? That is, if we were in a more open, tolerant society, is there anything psychologically damaging about someone engaging in a broad range of gender-variant behavior?
No. No, I think what Lisa said is really true, is that the distress comes in because kids are getting a lot of pressure, a lot of teasing. They're getting those messages that it's not okay. I'll tell you really quick, my absolute worst birthday ever was when I turned 11, and my dad had promised me a BB gun. And I was very excited about that. Well, apparently my mother got wind of that, and somehow I went to open my present. It was a slip and some curlers. I was mortified, and it worked. It worked really well, because look at me.
I would say, although I personally don't think that gender deviance in itself is pathological, I know that many practicing psychologists would disagree. The fact that there are clinics suggests that some view it as and I think there's going to be a lot of variation. I've talked to clinicians who have said, it may not intrinsically be bad in itself, but in this society, there is no way that a kid on the extreme end of the spectrum is not destined for some serious psychosocial problems. And the best way to avoid that is to manage the expression of the trait, which is what some clinics will try to do, is to not eliminate it, but manage the expression, hopefully to provide the child with an easier route through the world. Other clinicians have argued that the process of trying to, have sort of used a reparative therapy argument, saying the process of trying to manage the trait actually does more damage psychologically to the child than, helping them cope with bullying. So I would say that this, at least with regard to the psychological literature, you would find some pretty vigorous debate. Dave should speak to that.
Dave, yeah. And there are microphones also around you and behind you? Yeah.
I just want to, is it on? There's a challenge there. I think we have also created this sort of whipping boy of the gender clinics in treating people who express gender nonconforming behaviors. But the reality is that there are people who feel that their gender, the gender that they sort of believe they are, is incorrectly assigned with their physical sex. And I think we run the risk, though, in completely eliminating these clinics and this issue of that requires an intervention. It requires an elaborate, expensive surgical intervention. And so while I don't want to call it I don't know whether we call it, maybe we don't call it a psychological disorder, maybe we call it a physical disorder, but there needs to be some recognition that there is a problem there that needs to be corrected. Otherwise, no one's ever going to pay for these very expensive surgeries. And I also wonder what folks on the panel would have to say about this. Perhaps I think there's always going to be a subset of people that fall into that group that really desire that reassignment. Perhaps if we had a sort of a different culture, maybe there would be more people who felt comfortable sort of in that in-between space. And I'm wondering if you guys could comment on that.
Was the question if people, if individuals felt like they could be more expressive of their gender, would they necessarily feel like they needed to make surgical or physical changes? Was that your question?
I'm wondering about that.
Okay. I'm going to tell you that folks I have are absolutely, for the most part, there are differences for sure. Like some people, for instance, trans women who have penises, kind of feel okay about it, and especially if they have a girlfriend or they have a boyfriend, and they might be like, yeah, it's okay, it's fun, it works. And then there is a huge, probably majority of people who are absolutely horrified by the fact that they have a penis. I talked with someone yesterday, wears a swimming suit bottom in the shower every morning because can't stand to see the penis and really would like that gone. Well, that's what I guess I'm agreeing that, yeah, that there are things that need to be, and not true for everybody, but that for some people, they do need help, they do need support, they do need, or desire kind of different interventions, whether it's kind of psychosocial support or physical changes. The scary thing for me is that when people don't get their needs met, they take matters into their own hands. I know one person who put a rubber band around, I'll say, her penis, and probably had it there for a couple months before it got just terribly infected, and they took it off. So anyway.
I just want to say, Dave, just in terms of like, if there's distress, it needs treatment. I think the treatments that have been controversial, and the treatment that I was sort of referring to, is where the treatment is, well, you just need to learn to act more like your gender, and then the problem will go away. Which I think for children is the strategy that's more often taken. Once you have adolescence, I think often the counseling is a little bit more sophisticated, because then the question is this actually a trans person? But most folks, in the same way that you've talked about the invisibility of the queer child, most folks would never say, well, we've got a transgender, 3-year-old here. So I guess we better just, start accepting that we've got a trans baby and see what happens. Instead, the impetus is often, well, how do we manage this condition? And I'm sure that there are some sensitive therapists who will say to parents, you might have a transgender child, and let's wait and see what happens. But often it's the parents who want the problem to go away and would prefer to regulate it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is interesting, too. I'll say quickly, you probably saw the Barbara Walters 2020 special from 2007, I believe. So that's how recent it is, on transgender children, entitled My Secret Story, in which gender identity disorder was invoked throughout that, special. And there was a child as young as 6 years old whose parents were deciding to let that child essentially transition by wearing skirts to school and so forth, and change name and identity and so forth. The thing that's really striking to me, and this is a question for the study that you guys are doing, is how to get at the question of attraction. That was the question that was never asked. Sexual object choice off the table. As if we can only talk about sexual subjectivity with children if we draw this incredibly tight boundary and we promise it's only going to be about sexual subjectivity. It's not going to be about object choice. It's not going to be about attraction. How can a study begin to get at these other things? I mean, where do you put that on your activity sheet? Right. I mean, so this is the problem. We're doing interviews. Maybe you can do a kind of in-depth interview with Billy after he's been beaten to a pulp. Finally, maybe he gets to speak. And gets to speak about his relationship to the word gay or whatever word is important to him. But it's really odd, the only children that are getting to speak, like what extreme things they're having to go to before they get to be a speaking subject on this topic. And study design is incredibly complicated to get at this, which is why, in my view, only fiction and film has gotten there yet. Though you guys are clearly on the way to really interesting stuff. So, maybe just add that. Yeah, great.
Okay.
There was a question?
Yeah, right in the back. Yeah. Yep, you. Microphone coming to you. You need mic? Okay. Mic coming to you. Thank you.
I feel bad stealing his microphone.
That's okay. We're going to give it right back to him.
It'll be like a giving-taking thing.
Okay. I guess I'm a transgender woman who identifies as attracted to women. And so hearing this presentation, I was interested in knowing how much of, I guess this is for Dr. Diamond, but how much of this concern with GIDC is that sexuality is being lumped into it, gay, lesbian, bisexual being lumped into gender variant, and how much of it is a concern with the term itself, and that we're psychotic, that we that we have to get classified as a diagnosis of crazy before we can get anything done. And then secondly, I would say that as far as the problem, I mean, many of you addressed the issue of being more about homophobia and transphobia and the society reaction to that as the actual problem. And I just wonder if that's the actual problem, if maybe that could be in the DSM instead of the gender identity disorder, but having it be transphobia and homophobia being in the DSM. And to address whether that's a problem. I mean, what the problem is, I think, is really important to define. And as far as genitals or any other anatomy, that stuff gets internalized really, really early. And so to separate it as far as just somebody being irrationally detached from their body parts, as soon as I knew that I had a gender variance, I also knew that it was wrong. So that goes somewhere. And so at 5 and 6, that goes to body parts and things like that. And that's from outside generally. Anyway, I just wanted to know what you thought of that.
really great comments. One thing I'll say first about the whole issue of, maybe we should put homophobia in there as a diagnostic category. There's long been, I think, a really vigorous and I think a pretty important critique of the whole notion of homophobia, because it does a really good job of locating the problem in the individual rather than in a social structure that makes homophobia like a foregone conclusion. And so, although, you know, a homophobic society, I would rather have be the diagnosis in homophobic individuals, because it almost lets society off the hook to say, oh, look at these evil homophobic individuals, like we need to treat them. In terms of the collapsing of the psychopathology of being homosexual and the psychopathology of being gender, I think they depend on each other. I think that they structure one another. It's hard to think about the sort of stigmatization of gender deviance without the specter of homosexuality. So, I mean, I think that's one thing that's sort of interesting to watch the progression of the DSM, because although homosexuality is removed as a disorder, that sort of history in our culture of locating that as a pathology, you can't scrub out, right? You can't really get rid of it. And particularly in terms of trying to understand why parents, you know, and teachers and peers have the response that they do to gender deviant behavior. Those are absolutely, you know, interconnected. And so I think that those problems sort of, you know, co-create one another. But it is true that the phenomenon of being a gender typical or atypical child is going to be so socially dependent. It's going to be so context dependent. I mean, I've met families, you know, here in Salt Lake who are raising sort of somewhat trans children, and it's really